Okay, so this is part 2 of chapter 15, Proverbs. It's my reading and contemplation. For a full reading, I would refer to part 1. This part, I'm just going to pick up where I left off and continue until the end. We finished last time with verse 24, which reads, "The way of life is above to the wise, that he may depart from hell beneath." Now I decided to stop the last episode there. Number one, out of the interest of not making the episode too long. I think we ended at about 4 hours last time. Not all recorded in one sitting, of course, but in the second instance, this verse I think is particularly insightful, and I think it's going to take some care and some time to unpack. So let's begin again, anew this journey. The first thing we must discuss is the word above. This is a word that out of context is fairly simple. It's a direction. But within the context of this verse, it is pregnant with meaning. So let's say for a moment that we use this directional definition for the above. We have to ask ourselves, above relative to what? Moreover, in this environment that we are viewing, that we are seeing, what does that look like? What does that illustration represent? Certainly we are seeing a vertical here. That which is above and that which is below. The way of life is above to the wise. So to those of understanding, those who have found a way to be confident in something that is known about the world, about themselves, about the heavens, and not only have they found something that they have known, or rather that they know, they integrate this in such a way, this information in such a way, that they can direct their way and the way of others. I think that this, at least in part, has something to do with wisdom. So what of it? What of this above? Again, above relative to what? We could say in the first instance that we are thinking above the individual, above the self. But what does it mean to be above the self in this vertical? What else rests on this plane? Seemingly, what we are saying is that which will guide us is beyond the life of us, the individual. It is beyond me. So if I were to imagine something that is beyond me, or above me, not in a literal sense, of course, but in a sense of what? In a sense of understanding, in a sense of being, in a sense of satisfaction, a sense of knowing. I think it's important to recognize that this above, although it is beyond, that which is below, could also be considered beyond. It is beyond the self. It is beyond the self in all of the same sorts of characteristics. And so this above, and so as this below, is the levels and the layers of the ought, of the goodness, of the righteousness. The implication here being that what is above is better, and that which is below is inferior. The second half of the verse, that he may depart from hell beneath. And another usage of the word hell here. Not too often in the Old Testament do you see the word hell used. Plenty of times we see the word Sheol used as this pit of darkness, a place for both the living and of the dead. And here again, we see a similar illustration, this hell. Similarly, also implying that this could be a place for the living. For the dead don't depart from hell. But the verse says that he may depart from hell beneath. Now my conventional understanding of hell is quite poor. Is that of sort of the Sunday school, perhaps not even Sunday school, it's more of a cartoon version of what the actual symbol symbolizes. But if here we are to reflect on it for a moment, that if a man is to commit himself by his understanding to that which is above him, and every time he takes a step up this staircase of value and of virtue, he leaves behind him hell, a bit of this inferior way. And one has to wonder that at what point does something become hell? At what point does something become the above? Or is it relative to the person's place on that staircase? Not relative in totality, but just relative to the person's place on that staircase. In order for one to ascend, one must give up something to receive, to understand. It must give up some held notion, some falsely held notion that limits them from this ascent, that burdens them, it weighs them down, it fatigues them. And I think in this way, regardless of the level that we are at, we are met with this hell. It is that which is the burden to us that prevents us from that transcendence. Every step above we consider to be a level of transcendence. In this view, I think it unfortunate that hell must be with us at every step of the way. But our departure must be marked by something. And if we are to move to the fundament of all things, if we are to be principled people, to think about that which is at the bedrock, that which is most important, that which is the seed from which life and meaningful things spring, any limitation to that end, I think can be considered, if not evil. The place that we find ourselves in is hell of a certain sort. And so above is so below. Just as every step we take, we receive this above, we receive this intelligibility. And yet we face this new hell at the same time. Seemingly paradoxical. Again, I said it's unfortunate in a certain sense, because it seems Sisyphean that we endlessly push up this large stone boulder to the top of the hill, only for it to roll down again. But I think this would be a mistake, because instead of going absolutely nowhere in the vertical, we are and have the possibility of actually ascending and transcending a previous experience. And although it raises new questions, new dilemmas, new problems, new potentials for evil to infiltrate our spirit and our minds, our souls, the way of life is above. So I'd imagine that there would be other possible ways to perceive of this other than a staircase. But if we are to use the staircase analogy, I think we can zoom in a little bit. We could also zoom out and look at the whole and ask, is there a starting point and is there an ending point? Certainly for the individual man there is, at the time of his birth and the time of his death. But what about for man in general? Is there a time of his birth and a time of his death? A time of his birth into this form, and then perhaps a time of his death into a transformation into another? We have to wonder about these things on the eve of the artificial intelligence revolution. And how many prudent Christians out there are against this integration. I myself am certainly wary of it. But the thoughts, the conversations are out there about what the future looks like, about our survivability among producing machines that are much smarter than us. But if we zoom in and we take back into our forethought the experience of man, then we see individual steps in front of us. What does it mean to ascend? What does it mean to free ourselves from the burdens of hell? I think we are often gracious stewards of our hearts. But just like a parent who gives his child everything, I think we can be overgenerous, perhaps overbearing. I don't want to say too attentive, because that's not quite right. But it's misplaced attention. It is attention towards its suffering. But just like a child that cries, a child, as we all know, cries quite easily. Relatively simple matters in comparison to the adult. Their woes are simple. And as a matter of raising this child, there are times in which it is appropriate to comfort that child. But there are also times in which our comfort, our care, serves as an antagonism to that child's development. For they begin to believe that every trouble, no matter how small, can be abated can be abated by perhaps somebody else, but it can be forgiven without any difficulty, without any effort on the part of the individual. And what we find as we age is perhaps a heart is more sensitive than it ought to be, for it did not learn in its youth to discipline itself or the mind, just as the father or the mother does to the child that cries, to turn away and let the child figure it out. But they don't turn away out of neglect. They turn away out of attentiveness and understanding that this is what must happen in order for them to learn how to deal with the problems that confront them. And I think in relation to this ascent, in regards to this staircase, our own hearts, I think, are of this form. They are our adolescent child through which we experience the world. I think often the heart is quick to emotion, for that's its purpose and its duty. A well-trained heart will be stoic in times of difficulty and expressive when it's appropriate. But I think often our fears and our anxieties are one of the potentials by which this hell can grip us. Both our fears and our anxieties have a perverting effect on our attention. And our attention, especially in this modern world, this cognitive world, where probably 99 to 98% of us no longer work in agriculture. Many of us still work with our hands, but less and less so. The division of labor has offered us many opportunities. It has also brought to us many challenges, many unfulfilling jobs. But nonetheless, the heart must be quieted in order for it to be directed, in order for it to learn that not every problem is easy to solve, and although it may be troubled, it ought not to pervert our attention. And I think in this way, at the very least, if we are able to do this, we free ourselves from the chains of hell and may have the opportunity of moving upwards. Now, the way by which we do so, I think, is through discipline. It is to learn from the sorrows and the cries of the heart, and again, not to allow it to sabotage ourselves, but rather to discipline both the heart and the mind and the body, to focus on a central point, to accomplish something, and through this accomplishment, assuming that it is virtuous, it is ethical, then we ascend this staircase. There's another hell in here that can be wrought from this focusing of attention, for not everything that we attend to affords us the opportunity of ascent. While it may bring us greater material prosperity, it may deprive us in many other ways. Perhaps we will return to this illustration later. The Lord will destroy the house of the proud, but he will establish the border of the widow. So we are dealing with here a pattern of destruction and preservation. Destruction of the house and establishment of a border. Now what can we say of the destruction of this house? What does that mean? I think in a way, a house or a home can be represented sort of as a root into a particular geography. It is a root of a person or of a family, in this case a particular type of person. That is the house of the proud, which includes many people. Just like the second half of this verse, it's sort of a boundary that surrounds these people. But it's not just this boundary, which we will discuss when we discuss the second half of the verse, but rather it is a house, it is something distinct. And again, I think that this destruction refers to an uprooting. For if one is to uproot a plant, for example, even if we cut it off at the stem, it may still regrow if the roots are viable and they haven't been taken out of the soil. But once they are taken out of the soil, the plant effectively cannot regenerate. And this type of destruction, I think, is indicated here. Now, I don't think it necessarily means that the proud will be destroyed. Or rather, pride itself, the form of pride, I don't think that that will go anywhere. What this verse is saying is that wherever pride takes root, it is prone to being uprooted. It is sort of a self-limiting lifestyle. It's a self-limiting way. Their generations are poor to propagate. But just as man is born with two limbs, two upper extremity limbs, two lower extremity limbs, it seems as though the agent of the proud is always circling the human race. The human mind is always susceptible to catching that thing, this arrogance and pride, this inflation again of the self, of selfish desires taken to the extreme, in which we can call wickedness. But again, to reiterate, the symbol of the house is no small matter. And the fact that we are including people within this house, within this home, who are at some point going to be undeniably different in certain temperament, characteristic, and many other things, the way that they are similar is through that selfish inflation, that self-inflation, by which we might say pride takes root. That one's desire is almost a pornographic desire for the self, that the individual becomes in love with themselves instead of in love with God or something that is outside of themselves, something that they can sacrifice to. Instead, their sacrifices are internal. They provide a superficial and nominal way of seeing the world, in which all that really matters is the achievement of one's own personal desires. You'll have to forgive me for running in circles here, but I started this verse on a new day, important to understand, not for the sake of leniency, but rather for the affordance of opportunity, the understanding that the way many minds work, the way my mind works, is that we must throw into a problem pillars, similar to the second half of this verse, pillars by which we can identify some defining characteristic, some identity of the object of our thought or our discussion that provides its border. It provides us with the ability to identify everything, every object, every person, perhaps every thought. If it is to be known, it is identifiable, it is intelligible. But I think, unfortunately, to my mind, when I am beginning the process, it takes a lot of dropping of these pillars, almost like a dart. Perhaps we can imagine a dart just falling straight down into the earth. It sticks to the earth because it's sharp. It has the force of gravity behind it, and the ground, the earth, is soft enough to yield to it. And although it may seem repetitive, just looking at the hand dropping the darts down into the earth, eventually the gaze will be shifted from the hand that drops the darts down to the image that the darts begin to form. It is this image that we are concerned with. And so back to our main discussion. Again, we are dealing with two fundamental patterns, that of destruction and that of establishing. We've come to some understanding that the house can be seen in the totality of something, sort of analogous to that of a plant that has deep roots that are spread into the earth, that are hidden. And it takes almost that of divine insight, perhaps we can just say that of divine insight, to completely see exactly where all these roots go. For it is not in the earth that these roots populate. It is within the spiritual realm, the realm of the conscious understanding, the realm in which only conscious beings play. And I think in this space, it's difficult. Man is a bit of a hybrid between the earthly creature and the heavenly. And just as you can weed out the roots, the physical roots of a weed in his garden, he could weed out the roots of the wicked, of the evil, even the good, if he was so inclined, or of the proud, as we are discussing here. We went farther than that to say that the form of pride is not really what we're talking about in this verse, but rather the ways in which pride can embody itself, the ways in which it can become personified, if you'd like. And similar to the analogy that I had just put forth about these darts forming the image, I think pride can infect man in a similar way. To him, seemingly, what invades his space, what he chooses to accept as relatively mundane. He feels as though what he is giving up, even though it is on the side of wickedness, is not all that bad. And because of this mundane nature, because of the slow march of the fundamentally negative or the fundamentally oppositional, because of the slow march of this thing, it flies under our radar. Now I speak in broad generalities here, but assuming that there are few that are truly evil just as there are few that are truly good, we have to admit to ourselves, I have to admit to myself, that this slow march and my willingness to accept this slow march as a worthy trade. We're getting into the realm of temptation, no doubt. But as a worthy trade, for what? For what exactly? For the feeling, the hit, the high that one receives by viewing oneself highly above another, perhaps. That's not quite it. This is the end result. This is how pride finds us. It's not pride itself. And so what exactly are we sacrificing? If we are to eventually become these self-interested, prideful people, by what way? By what sacrifices? Again, we have the slow march. Within the slow march is its convincing nature. It's not all that bad. But it is bad. And because of the decreased severity of the negativeness, perhaps the darkness, we don't think much about that little dart. And it's not until the boundary surrounds us, just like in a previous proverb, that of the thorn bush that surrounds the slothful or the foolish, that hesitates to act, and eventually enough time has passed where the thorn bushes has completely surrounded him, and the only way out of his predicament is through extreme suffering and pain. The way that a man of pride can be saved, how can a man of such a bend be able to even see exactly what it is that plagues him? Because he's trapped in the prison cell of the self, of the mind, and of superficial pursuits and goals. So perhaps this slow march is like a mason. It is a mason of evil that slowly, brick by brick, day by day, as he chooses to ignore this person, eventually the mason builds a wall around him. That wall becomes his own prison. This person unable to see what is happening because he is not looking outside, he's looking inside to himself. And so what of this person then, when he is walled off from the rest of the world, and now all that he has is himself? This is like cutting or blocking an artery to a tissue. That which is necessary to sustain life is the oxygen and the nutrients. Without that, the cells distal to the lesion or to the thrombus will perish. And I think it's a similar way, or in a similar manner, this happens to that of, my mind keeps wanting to say negative virtues, but that doesn't make any sense. It's not a virtue, it's pride. It's an antagonism to virtue. We can perhaps call it a vice or an iniquity. Immoral. And so this man is in his prison. And just like a man in prison, he is unable to propagate himself into the future. Whether that be a physical way or by way of this analogy to the roots that bury themselves into the earth, the man that is in prison is unable to extend his roots into the spiritual world and into the physical. And I think it is in this way that the selfish man, walled from the rest of it all, is destroyed by God. And the irony of my interpretation here is that the evil mason was the undoing of this man, almost as if evil itself is the destructive force, even if it destroys itself. So although it assisted in this will of God, in fact it is the will of things, it is the way of things. So let's continue. And as we move forward in our rearview mirror, we see this continual atrophy of the prideful man, the vessel that has been shut. He slowly starves on this spiritual nourishment. In his own delusion, he finds his prison and his tomb. But he, referring to the Lord, will establish the border of the widow. This is a fundamental distinction here. The border is a fundamental way in which our minds, I think, process information, because we are fundamentally pattern-seeking creatures. And just as I have explained, just as I have analogized with the dropping of the dart into the earth to form an image that forms a border, again, it forms something that is intelligible to us. It makes sense. It's a recognizable pattern. It is something that can be set apart from other things. It has its own identity. Now, the important thing here, just as before we were thinking of destroy, here we are thinking of establish, because it is not the border that is established, just as in the previous, I think, part of this verse. It is not the form of pride itself that is destroyed. It is we could say, the individual, the boundary of that individual, and its ability to propagate into the future that is destroyed. What is established here is not necessarily the border itself, because a widow will always be something. A woman who loses her husband, or perhaps divorces her husband, or husband leaves her, whatever the case is, that makes her a widow, that will exist. The establishment does not mean to create the border of the widow. God is not creating widows by killing their husbands or whatever. This is much more subtle, and I think much more profound. It is the establishment, in the sense that there is something looking out for, but more importantly, it places a context for that border, for the border that is. This border is now placed in a particular context within the society, within the culture, that it is a protected border. By the context of the verse, I think we have to accept this. The Lord will destroy the house of the proud, but he will establish the border of the widow. Establishment is a firm continuation. The widow that has been wronged by the nature of things, the unfortunate reality and the harshness of the natural world, may rob a person of their love. This may be independent of God's will. This is just the happenings of the novel that have been written, that have been allowed to unfold, given the laws and the constraints of that reality that have been set forth into motion. But I have to imagine that this establishment is, to a degree, a divine order. For we understand the role of the woman in our society, regardless of the diffusion of responsibility in the rich and successful societies, the woman at some point plays a vital role. And that family unit, if it's not strong, will have a profound negative impact, I think, on the structural integrity of the culture and of a society and of its institutions, political and otherwise. And so, when a woman loses her husband, in the cases in which the window to parenthood and to the continuation of one's line, of one's lineage, of one's family, that type of responsibility, when we are in that headspace, I think that the establishment of that border so that we can firmly intuit that of the widow is important. And the question is, well, why is it important? Why is it established? Well, again, because of the importance of the woman in society. She is the nurturing element. She is the one that chooses the mate in many situations. She is the one that corrects the male, or may correct the male in many cases, to make him more of a caring and loving father, nurturing father. Of course, not in every situation. The reverse may be true in some situations, but the burden of responsibility for bearing the child is upon the woman, and at the very least, I think it prompts her to this type of self-reflection, where the male may not be afforded that opportunity. He certainly has opportunities, and if he is prudent, if he is of the righteous mind, he will engage by sheer will in these sorts of internal reflections and external about the nature of the family that he wants to build. The widow is a vulnerable member of society. By establishing her border, by illuminating her plight, her experience, I think we provide a degree of security culturally. The multitude surrounds her, keeps her safe like a herd of elephants that protects the baby elephant. I believe that the African water buffalo does similar, that they keep their young on the inside of that herd, and they face outward so they can all see, so this multitude has a protecting effect for the young against the predators. The thoughts of the wicked are an abomination to the Lord, but the words of the pure are pleasant words. The thoughts of the wicked are the thoughts of the selfish. Again, a wicked person is confined. They are much diminished people, although they may be particularly successful, especially in the modern day, or especially, I should say, in any era in which the institutions have gone astray, that the alignment between their objectives and the objectives of the way of God's will, we can say the directed conscious experience of our reality that's beyond man, then we will begin to slowly see an erosion and the crumbling of the foundations of those institutions, but also the gradual perversion therein, in which you will have the wicked that rise rather swiftly to the top, and they will gather a lot of power to themselves, sort of like a black hole. They will, or a hurricane perhaps, it'll uproot anything that is not firmly rooted, and it'll gather all of that information, that knowledge, that power within itself, and it'll feed off of it. And I think in this way it's an abomination to the Lord, because it draws into itself again. It has no concern for that which is outside of itself or above it. But the words of the pure are pleasant words. Now I think to be pure implies that they are free of sin, that they are not guilty in the divine courts. And because of this, their speech, their thoughts, they live in this Eden of thoughtful experience. It's untainted by the destructive elements of man. I think in my mind, a pretty landscape, a landscape perhaps that has been touched by man, but it has not been destroyed by man. It is not perverted by endless rows of concrete, but rather curated and made better by his presence. He that is greedy of gain troubles his own house, but he that hates gifts shall live. I see here the perversion of one's attention to that which is lower, the focusing of one's ascent in life on the inferior qualities of the step. Again, this is a reference to our earlier illustration that upon the staircase from the base of consciousness to that of the highest heavenly that man can achieve, every step of the way he is faced with two paths and two options. On the one, he is placed with the good, and on the other, the evil. And I think often what we are tempted by is the false perception of that good. Now what I see here, he that is greedy of gain troubles his house. It is just this. This person is so wanting to gain something. It could be to gain some material edge on his neighbor, or to improve his material standing in life. That in and of itself is not necessarily the bad thing, but the greed is that key there. For greed is an intense and selfish desire for something. And usually when we think of greed, we place it in the context of something that is lower, something that is, or without proper context. So something like wealth, power, food. Now there are certain ways of seeing, we could say, that allows wealth and power and food not to be negative, surely. But again, we are talking about this in the context of a broader point, that of greed. It's an intense selfish desire. Selfish being this internal prison. And if we are to be encapsulated, if we are to be surrounded by that evil that places one brick at a time slowly surrounding us while we are busy looking at the ground or anywhere else besides this evil that is slowly building this prison, what we are consumed with is wealth, power, or food, and it's that distraction from the attention, and that attention by which we would otherwise be liberated if we had noticed the evil that surrounds us. And so it is this distraction and this perversion of attention that trouble the house, because the house itself will be surrounded by this evil. It will become the prison of that selfish desire. or in this context, I think we understand that the man is the head of the house. He is the provider. And his behavior, his action, does a lot to affect the house. In the modern day, I think we're in such a strange position. We have been raised under such an interesting set of ideals and principles and false hopes. I think that many of us, myself included, have great difficulty in understanding exactly what path it is that we should walk. Not only is there great difficulty, I think that there is a burden of guilt that comes from the lack of acceptance of anything, of any path that should be walked at all. I think there's a guilt associated with the observation. For if one is to observe that there are many traps lain about us, around us, and we become agents that are inactive, we are guilty of that inaction, but also innocent of an action that would otherwise make us guilty, participating in something that, for the larger context, is after greedy ends, or ourselves being tempted and slowly eroded by the factor of greed. It's a difficult situation. But he that hates gifts shall live. Now what should this mean? What is a gift? Now, in our common understanding, a gift is something that is given to somebody for a special occasion, for an achievement, for the celebration of something. And we accept these gifts. We take them in acknowledgement of somebody else's acknowledgement of us. Now, it is possible that this verse is referring to the acceptance of a gift as the acceptance of some selfish desire, that they are admitting to the person that is celebrating them that they ought to be celebrated and they ought to take what is given to them. I think this might be a poor reading or interpretation. Although there may be a sliver of truth there, I think there is something more that we can do with this. For of a gift, we can think of something also as something that is given willingly to somebody without payment. And perhaps there is something in this relationship, if we free ourselves from much of the modern way of doing things. Or we can just say, as we zoom out, the conventional way of doing things, because I don't think that money or payment in the physical sense is really unique to the modern age. But if we zoom out, we arrive at convention. We zoom out farther, what do we find? Perhaps we arrive at something like bartering, which is this trade of something valuable, of something that is of similar value. Okay, so now we are in the sphere of value. So what does this mean, to trade something of value for something else that is perceived to be of similar value, or is a worthy trade? Well, it means we are making an ethical decision. Because what we perceive to be valuable, I think, is the degree to which we are making a statement about the standard of something, about its worth, about its usefulness, about its merit. And by extension, our desire of that thing, our judgment, flows in connection to that value with our desire, the desires of the heart. And certainly we can make a trade in such a way that the desire for the object that we are trading for is perverted. It may be false. It may be under the temptation by this step that we had mentioned before. As we attempt to ascend, we make these trades, we make these sacrifices, and yet the false sacrifice, whether it's known to us or unknown or deceived of us, upon this perception of value and our action and our behavior therein in the world, is an extension of our being and is prone, or it is susceptible, or it is calling for judgment. And I think when we call for judgment, whether we're aware of it or not, it'll find us. And if we desire the good, then what we ought to, when we call for this judgment, we ought to be willing to accept the punishment. Now I understand I'm moving in a few different directions here, but I think there's a general trend in direction. And I have to wonder about this gift, about this trade, about this value, about what we are accepting. Because what we trade is our, let's take a particular example, for I'm not entirely sure that every example is the same. But let's take the example of achievement. What are we saying when we accept the bestowing of a material good upon us? We are saying that the other person's acknowledgement of my success and my behavior, the way that I have conducted myself, is worthy of the value that is placed in that material object, however small it might be, or large. And this I have some difficulty with, and I have to wonder whether I am reading the correct or the most illustrative translation of this verse. But nonetheless, I'll continue. I find it difficult because accepting a gift, it doesn't have to be for one's achievements, it could be more grounded and rooted in celebration. That these gifts, whether it be of compliment of a verbal sort or of a material sort, certainly they have their place in our experience. Perhaps it is a kind of gift. A gift that can be thought of as a bribe to influence one's behavior towards something negative. Now, to hate such a thing, I certainly understand, because this is to hate a false value or false equivalencies. However, this seems like low-hanging fruit to me, because we still have to determine exactly what about this gift-giving is acceptable in society. We have determined the dangers, of which the entirety of the interpretation, if it were to rest upon, I would not find it satisfying. And that is that the giving of gifts in the absence of exchange, and let's go further and say true exchange, which is difficult to judge in the human context, but nonetheless, in the absence of true exchange of value, and I should, before I progress, I think I should say that if someone is to give a material good for the achievements of another, even if I am to say that the achievements are not enough to accept the gift because of the dangers that it poses to this temptation that we are talking about, of the evil that surrounds us brick by brick before we know it, we are in this selfish prison. I think that is one possibility, an avenue that a gift can open for the mind of man. However, an equivalency in value I don't think necessarily has to be a mechanical or mathematical thing. Perhaps mathematical, but if it is mathematical, it must be endowed with meaning. Mechanical, I use in the sense that it is not endowed with meaning. It is purely based on the desire for something to be equivalent. But if our definition of equivalent is beyond that just of a material equivalency, that if we in our scenario, upon our success, receive a material good from somebody else, perhaps it is our duty to make it known to the gift giver what this achievement means, not for the self, but for the future, and what they plan to do with that achievement. For in such a case, the gift giver is brought in on the righteous experiment, let's say. It is not just the graduation from some university to get some job, to have some material benefit, to have some comfort in life. This is certainly not something that's worth celebrating. It is what we have opened for ourselves, the opportunity for the good that we are able to give to the world. And that plan and that idea, that intelligible sphere ought to be made known to the gift giver. And I think that if it's done rightly, and I think we can see how it's possible to be done rightly, just given the minimal discussion that we've had here, then I think we can find some equivalency. We can find a just transaction. But saying for a moment that this verse entirely meant bribery, which is common in the ancient world, is common in the modern day, probably will always be common, given the heart of man, given his nature, given his what he faces on his ascent towards something better. Then I think at the very least we have satisfied that meaning. And for meaning that is a bit more difficult to find in terms of gifts in general, again beyond that of convention, and into the realm of what we consider to be truly valuable, beyond material value. Although material value is something that is to be considered if it is connected to, and it most surely is in most cases, the desires of the heart and of the passions that are therein facilitated and communicated to the soul. Our ideas of these things and the value that we are able to, even if it be feebly, attribute to our material existence, I think it is worthwhile to put into practice this sentimental, perhaps discerning thought into such an exchange. Difficult as though it may be, contemplative in every circumstance, it must be, but I think that gives credence to the idea that if we are going to engage in some sort of gift-giving or exchange in general, it ought to be few enough to be manageable, or if it is to be multiplicitous, it must be simple enough to be managed by some large principle of mind. The heart of the righteous studieth to answer, but the mouth of the wicked poureth out evil things. Now, on my journey here, I have made amendments to previously held ideas, as one ought to do, and this verse prompts me to do so. The heart of the righteous studies to answer, but the mouth of the wicked poureth out evil things. What I have in mind and what I have changed is my idea of the heart. I started with a fairly basic understanding of the heart, and perhaps it can be used in multiple different contexts, but as a principled manner, I would like to have a good understanding of what the heart is as a symbol. And up until this point, I've considered the heart to be somewhat of a filter for man. We could say something that is specific, that is part of his soul, but it is also the seat of his desires. It represents, in a way, but also in a way not, a lower part of himself, an undirected part of himself, that requires some of the higher pieces of his directed being to modify and to direct the heart. And the reason that I say that is because the heart can be a deceptive force, that we can feel a particular way about something and have it be completely wrong. That it can produce emotions for us, that it can excite us in such a way that is sinful. But certainly, the rational, directed mind is a co-conspirator in that event, we would have to admit. And then I took steps to amend that, and to add that the heart has a degree of agency of its own. Again, remembering that this is a symbol. And that the seat of our feelings and our desires, though it may be, it begins to become something of a wise actor. Again, if matured, just like the rational directed mind, if it is matured, it can be quite sophisticated. And in such a way, the heart, as it feels, as it becomes wise, or wiser, as it understands its own nature, exercises its agency rightly, it becomes in alignment with the truth. So that when we feel excitement, it is because we ought to be excited. That whatever is the cause of that, whether it be the love that we experience when we hug another person, or because of some potential danger, it is rightly oriented. It is in the appropriate place. And that those things on the opposite ends of the spectrum that perhaps excite us now that ought not to excite us, perhaps like the sexual arousal in a public setting that is not reserved for their own relationship and within the confines of the loving boundary, then this is something that the heart ought to be educated on. But as we can see in this way, in my conception, it has something unique to it. And when I talk of the mind of man, I may imply, though not in every case, that there is that rational directed component that doesn't necessarily abide by the feelings and desires, which is the thing that allows them to see beyond it. And I think it's the relationship between the two, the heart and this directed mind, that again can go in the other direction, that the directed mind can pollute the innocence of the heart, or the rightness of the heart, to follow its direction. And so the heart of the righteous studies to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. And so I think, in light of what I've said, that if the heart of the righteous, if what we are to interpret by the heart of the righteous studies to answer, then it is because of this alignment problem and process. The heart of the righteous being an important word, that of the good, that of the upright, that of the prudent, those that are concerned with the correct moral judgments. They study to answer. But what exactly are they answering? They are studying to answer the dilemmas that face it, and it being the heart, and the dilemmas being any number of things, anything that seems to give us discomfort. Those anxieties, those existential questions, those feelings of despair, those feelings of sorrow. But it need not limit itself to the reflection on the negative and the down. For if we are to ascend that staircase up to the heavenly, it must also understand that of the good, that of the loving, that of the kind, that of the relational. And although we may desire this to just come to us, I think man is a fairly blank slate, unfortunately. And because of this, because of his freedom of will, and because of the possibility of direction and explosiveness of the possibility of different things that he could be attending to, it requires this reflection, it requires this orientation of mind and attention towards those things that are actually meaningful. And I think we can get away quite simply, like Forrest Gump, who commits himself to simple principles and achieves quite a bit in life. But as a matter of finding those principles and having absolute faith, I think many of us, myself foremost, I think faces a lot of these tests. And perhaps I shouldn't say foremost, that would be selfish to say. But I certainly face it. And these tests ought to be something that provokes us to study rather than to provoke us to dulling of the mind through whatever means at hand. But the mouth of the wicked pour out evil things. They are the distraction of this alignment. These evil things pull away from the conduit of the mind of man, his soul, his heart, everything. It pulls away. So that just like a pipe in which water flows through and it connects to another pipe, it's like moving that pipe out of the way, that inferior pipe out of the way, so that when the water moves through that pipe, it does not enter the next pipe, and thereby it does not reach its destination to fulfill its purpose. The Lord is far from the wicked, but he hears the prayer of the righteous. An interesting verse. And I say it's interesting because of the word but. The Lord is far from the wicked. Seemingly simple and easy to understand. We understand the Lord to be good and not wicked. It makes sense that he would be far from such things. But he hears the prayer of the righteous. And you would think that that word would be and he hears the prayer of the righteous. But it is but. seemingly to imply that although God is far from the wicked, he still hears the righteous. But he shouldn't be far from the righteous, should he? And so I think that prompts us to think about what it means to be a human being and what it means to be righteous in our context. For we are not perfect beings. We all are sinners. We are all fallen. And I think that this is what this implies. But of course, the reason that the Lord hears the prayer of the righteous is because it is in that conduit. It is, those two pipes are in line. The Lord is able to hear where if those two pipes were separated again, just like that water analogy, the information that we put forth would not reach that divine awareness. And this righteousness, as opposed to the wickedness, is that very alignment. The light of the eyes rejoices the heart, and a good report makes the bones fat. I think the first part of this verse is another analogy to attention, because we see light and we see of the organ that senses intelligibility. Now, for the organ that senses intelligibility to have light to be of the eye, it implies, again, a degree of agency, just like we talked about with the heart. But I think it is that direction of the eye, that specific intelligibility that it chooses to see, that what I was about to say is the rejoicing of the heart. But upon further reflection, the light of the eyes rejoiceth the heart. So that which is rejoicing is the light of the eyes. It is that direction towards that particular type of information, that particular kind of information, that seemingly allows it, which is that sense organ, but I think further means perception and that rational directed mind, that then rejoices the heart, because it is able to, I think, instruct the heart. The heart is able to feel rightly. It seemingly and instantly becomes relational between this direction of the mind and of the desires, the feeling nature of the heart. And a good report makes the bones fat. Now, low-hanging fruit here. A good report makes the bones fat. We could think of a good decision that leads one to some sort of prosperity in which they are able to consume more. But like I said, that's low-hanging fruit. A good report, a good idea, good feedback gives us confirmation. It gives us confidence in what we know. It allows us to act appropriately and rightly. And the bones in this way, I think, could be thought of in the case of more of a sustaining or a subsistence level analogy, but also a structural analogy. The bones fat is to imply that the bones are the structure of the body. They are the things by which we are able to have muscular control and manipulate things in the world. It is our connectedness to the world, in some sense. Or it increases our connectivity and our relationship to it. And these bones, serve as the foundation for the somatic part of ourselves. the somatic part of ourselves, obviously again being this conduit, this transjective into the world with all of its sensory receptors within it that we integrate into our understanding and perception, that our consciousness does not exist in some darkened vacuum, that we seemingly have some environment here to play in. And to make the bones fat, I think, is just like we were talking about this alignment with the heart and the directed mind. The body comes with it. The body is an important part of our experience and our existence here. And just as much as the mind can be aligned with God, the body must be aligned with this natural world and reality, and with God as well. For it is not unknown to us in the modern day that the sins of the mind can lead to the sinful expression, physical expression of the body. The ear that hears the reproof of life abideth among the wise. This is a verse that we see often in some form or another. The ear that heareth reproof of life abides among the wise. It is that listening to the correction of one's previously misdirected ways that allows one to make that correction and further this alignment process, to move that conduit, that communicative apparatus of the mind towards that of the divine that we are made in the image of. And this image is a reflection on the similarity of our ability, of our conscious ability. And so it is this that we add to our conception and our understanding of the wise. If we are to be among them, this is a quality that we must possess. He that refuses instruction despises his own soul, but he that hears reproof gets or getteth understanding. So a similar pattern. Another verse that touches on something similar but yet is not quite the same. So we must ask the question, why? Why is it the case that he that refuses instruction despises his own soul? The word despise is quite a descriptive word. It may be an intense word. So we must imagine that there is a strong relationship between instruction and the soul. And I think by extension we can imagine the soul growing through instruction. And so it makes us wonder, in the event that if one was or were to despise the soul, that in the case of proper instruction, how is the soul benefited? In what way can we conceptualize the soul? I have hitherto referred to the soul as the seat of being. That in and of itself seems to be a difficult descriptor, the seat of being, because I think a fundamental question is, what does it mean to be? And it's not an easy answer, it's not an easy exploration. But I think that's part of the point here, is that through instruction, we learn how to be. We learn how to behave, how to become, how to believe, how to be of benefit, how to begin a journey, how to become. I think all of these things are involved in being. They involve directionality, orientation to that which is higher, towards some way of being that is of a greater sort than one currently possesses, that through this instruction we can ascend through the staircase of meaning and purpose, and inevitably find ourselves closer and closer to that heavenly sphere. Now, if one is to despise one's own soul, they are in effect despising what it means to be, and by extension they are despising their own existence. A terrible psychological dilemma to find oneself in, surely. Surely we might call this a state of depression, perhaps in extreme cases a form of psychosis. But to have this impulse, this repugnance, just as one might have a repugnance to some foul odor or some foul person, the instinct is to remove ourselves from that situation. And to remove ourselves from our existence is death. It can be suicide, it can be behavior that is so reckless that can lead to one's own harm. All because the path to solving one's dilemmas about the unanswered questions of existence offer an unfortunate, or fortunate depending on how we approach the problem, but those that choose the despising path viewed these questions as unfortunate. Perhaps the answers that they have come to are nihilistic. They're hopeless, meaningless. But on the other hand, those that exalt the soul, that they make the proper sacrifices, they listen to the instruction so that they walk the path up that staircase, their experience of life is opposite. And surely it is a choice how we choose to live our lives. But as I've said before in this chapter, that ascending that staircase involves, at every step, the decision between two paths. One riddled with temptation and with evil, and another with ascent, but also testing. But he that hears reproof gets understanding. This is sort of the logical conclusion to this verse, that this reproof, the illumination of one's misdeeds or misbehavior, this allows one to self-reflect and understand and how to self-correct, how to course-correct. The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. Now, I've maintained in the Proverbs, my interpretation of the Proverbs, that humility is the foundation of all virtue. In the language, the fear of the Lord is nothing new. We see this all over the Bible. And at once, this occurs less and less to me so today, after going through this process so many times. But the fear of the Lord, I think, can be seen as a negative thing. Fear itself is undesirable. We fear something because of the potential for danger, some potential harm that produces in us a state of arousal, agitation, alarm. I think of not too long ago when I went camping with a few friends. We stayed a relatively remote place, and at night you hear all sorts of interesting things. At once, one thinks it may be another person that is watching, for you know that they, if they are out there, can see you because of the illumination of the fire, and you cannot see out to them. And it produces an uneasy unsettling feeling, a bit of a fear, I guess we can call it. But the fear of God is not so much in this way. It is to a degree, because there is a lot of uncertainty, and insofar as we are uncertain of certain things, we ought to be in a state of agitation, in a state of readiness. For if our laws and our nations were so foreign to us and uncertain, perhaps, and so absolute, I think that this would cause a degree of fear and agitation as well. And when we are fearful of the Lord, we are fearful to a degree judgment. And this state of agitation ought to prompt us into action, rather than sedentary slothfulness, so that we may hear that instruction, hear where that anxiety is coming from, because it is telling us to listen. And that wisdom begins with that listening, in the integration of the information that we hear. Because what we would like is to walk in the righteous path, so that we can be judged rightly, not as though we would be judged wrongly. But we want to make decisions such that we are certain that we are in the right. And we must listen before we act. And I think often that the discipline and process of prayer and self-reflection are the beginnings of this, what can we say, the path to righteousness, or the instruction of wisdom. Before honor is humility. And to be humble is to be patient. To be humble is to accept one's own limitations. To be humble is to understand that we do not know everything. To be humble is to be open and willing to learn what is true, what is right. And one gains honor through achievements, and one achieves by knowing what to do, by being decisive, by being discerning, which begins in virtue. So this concludes chapter 15 of the Proverbs. I'll begin next time with chapter 16.